We are in Titus chapter 1, verse 8. Titus chapter 1 and verse 8. Last week, we looked at the first two qualifications that were given in this verse. And so I just want to remind us of where we are. It began with the qualifications of the home, and that is that he had demonstrated this in his home life, both with his wife and his children, spiritual qualifications of spiritual leadership and spiritual character. And then we looked in the next verse about a series of negatives, okay, that qualified as being blameless, and all these kind of things that need to make sure we're not there, because it indicated if you can't control yourself over that, then we're going to have some real issues. But last week, and we actually spent quite a bit of time putting all of this into context last week for the idea of what all is contained here, the move to the more positive and the nature of what these are about in their focus. And what we're seeing is that we have here internal characteristics that are expressed in external ways. And the difficulty of understanding that these are things that have to be, in some way, visible in their application. Or they can't be used as a qualification. There's no way to kind of look out and say, did someone have this kind of character, unless there are manifestations of how this is seen. But what you're seeing here in this verse is that these are internal. Last week's, or the verse before that, it's the same idea, but the nature of seeing those negatives is usually pretty clear. They've got some real bad warning signs, and that's what he said. You need to be aware that there are some warning signs that this man does not have what it takes to lead spiritually. Doesn't have the character for it. But now we're looking, and we also have to not just say he has certain outward things in the home, right? And he doesn't have some of these things in his life, but now we have to do the hard work of seeing and looking for things that show us he has positive characteristics. Not just a lack of something, that we know there's a positive. So last week we looked at, first of all, being hospitable. And that is the idea of showing love to strangers and turning strangers into friends. And having that as a core part of, and it's developed to where these people matter, and I'm going to show them that they matter to me. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Then we looked at what a lover of what is good is, and the idea of you look at both of these, one is looking out at people that you don't know, and the other is more abstract, that describes a characteristic of God, and that these are things that really matter. What happens to other people matters. What is right and aligns with God matters. So with that in mind, then, we look at the next characteristic that is, in the New King James, rendered sober-minded. Now, does anyone have a different translation of this word in your Bible? It is a really interesting word to try to figure out the best way to translate. That's a later word. But this is, we're going to get to that at the end. Well, I'm not going to promise that. We may get to that at the end. The word for sober-minded here has the idea of thinking that puts you in safe spaces. I mean, that's a real loose paraphrase. And it's the idea of, I put it in a general sense, and if you just put one word, it's prudence. And it's a very practical thing about thinking. And when you say prudence, you're aware and have thought through the different scenarios of something, and you're trying to make sure you avoid any any big problems. That's really what prudence is, and that's kind of what this word has in mind. And I want you to stop and think for a second about why that kind of characteristic of thinking about spiritual things, things that pertain to a congregation, things that pertain to the church as a whole, to individual lives, about someone who takes the time to, we'd say, mull over things, to think about these things, and to make sure that any advice given, any course of action that the congregation should take, that we don't want to do the wrong thing. Now, this is not to say it's so cautious as to we're never going to do anything. Okay, that is key. That's not what this word is. It's the idea, though, of looking over options and giving it full thought, that I'm going to seriously consider what kind of decision we're going to make here. So, can you see how that would be? I hope that by that description you can see why elders would need to have that kind of characteristic.
Would that be more like, could you say, straight thinking, straight, honest thinking? When you talk about mulling it over, making sure that's what I think of straight thinking. You look at pros, cons, the situation, whatever.
Well, at some point, then I'm going to ask you what you mean by straight thinking. It's the idea of you want to make sure you're putting everyone in the best position possible. And so whatever is the proper term, and that's going to differ based upon maybe where you grew up for this word, honestly, is that you're wanting to make sure that you don't want to be the reason to have caused a problem. You don't want to have made a decision. And here's what's hard. There is not going to be a situation where you're always going to have found the best decision always. Okay, everyone? I'm sorry. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. But what you're looking for is men who give it as much thought as possible. Not that their decisions will always be just spot on perfect. But you know what? You don't want, and this is where we get the value, what's the opposite of doing that? Yeah, okay, yes, rash. I heard something else. Hasty, good. Yes, is it, or the idea of you just go ahead and you have that kind of thing where you got to do something, so you just kind of move ahead, and we've got a decision, so I've got to have a decision now, so I'm going to do it. You don't want that for spiritual decisions. You don't want to have the idea of I've got to do something and something's better than nothing. Sometimes something is much worse than nothing if it's the wrong thing. So you don't want to get to the idea of being pushed into hasty decisions or making decisions without proper. Think about Jephthah. You don't want Jephthah in the eldership, right? Of saying things and committing to things and not thinking through the potential consequences of that decision. You want to have thought it through as best you can of all the options. And sometimes, let me tell you, sometimes the problem is you can see flaws in every option you've got. And you've still got to do something. Are y'all aware this happens in life? Because y'all don't look like you believe me. Okay. Sometimes in life, there's not a great option. You're left with trying to find the best option of some not so great options. And so you're trying to make those decisions, okay? So, but to get there, you want to make sure that you're thinking it through and you're mulling it over, you're looking down the road at the possibilities, you're working out how you think and how many steps you can go ahead to try to imagine how this will affect everybody. Can you imagine going through, and this is a particular, I'll give you an example, and it's a really bad example, but it's the only one I've got right now. I'm considering changing the schedule at the school, just slightly. Okay? So just basically moving chapel back an hour, changing with the first hours of the day a little bit, moving the days at the end, taking those out. No big deal, right? Unless you're the students and the teachers who are going to be affected by this. Which means before I do that, I'd better have thought through how it affects everybody there. Is this going to, and talk to them maybe about it if I can. Guess what? You can always talk to people about it. But you try to say, okay, how does this affect this person? How does this schedule going to work? Okay, I've got to go over and I've got to talk to Willie on the Spanish side. How is it going to affect them and their teachers? They run a different kind of slate in some cases because they're off from us. I set it up where we work. But if I just went in and just threw it out there and didn't consider that, I might have a number of problems I'm having to deal with later, and I'm constantly surprised by the problems that I myself have caused. That's what kind of thinking you don't want. So you're looking for men that demonstrate. Now we get to the next part, which is harder, which is how do you recognize that in someone? If these are qualifications, and he is saying, Titus, you need to find men that are like this. He's looking for men who are sober-minded. You're trying to spot them. What are you looking for? Tracy?
You're looking for discernment and for someone who's not constantly surprised.
Okay. She said, you're looking for someone with discernment, and that is, I'd say, start by saying, a recognition of the situation for what it is, what the options are, and what should be preferred and the reasons why. I'd put all that under discernment. And then also, the second part of this was that you're looking for someone that, when things happen, is not surprised. That at the very least, they're ready for that next problem because they thought that could happen with those kind of decisions, right? Okay, so that means that there's an aspect of preparedness to this, isn't there? There's a mental, intellectual, spiritual preparedness that has to come with this, that we've thought through things to say how will this work ahead and affect things. You think about the difference of how decisions can affect someone who's a new Christian, how you can versus a more mature Christian. How a decision can affect people of different demographics, right? Well, let's take a very simple example, okay? Very simple example. Everyone's favorite, when do we meet? Right? And everyone knows the best time to meet on Sunday morning would be 7 a.m. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I don't think I've got anyone with us there. We're going to be very lonely at 7. Okay. Is it, why? Because there are all sorts of challenges to get up. It's hard enough when you have to do it and say, wait a minute, I don't even have to get up to school by that time. Well, it's going to affect this people. Can you imagine trying to scramble and you've got little kids? That's a challenge to get all those little kids ready in that amount of time. It's not just about you getting up and going to work. You're getting a family ready to go. That has to be a consideration. What is the other consideration? Okay, you're right, absolutely. So we need to shift everything later. We'll come in later. But that means we'll have to push the evening, and that needs to be probably like at 9 p.m. So everything is later now. Well, now we got issues unnecessarily maybe that we have to consider. Do some people have a harder time driving, right? Do you have, okay, that won't work. You've got an early time to get up for work. You've got practical things like, you know how many problems you get into just for getting together to do things? Since y'all altered your time, have you found that it's easier to do some of those things after Sunday night because you're meeting a little bit earlier? You have a little bit more time. You don't have to rush away the same way. There are a lot of just these practical things if you're thinking about the end in mind of what the value is in them. So every little decision, but it affects people differently. So I'm going to go through, and in my head, I'm going to look through, maybe pull out my copy of the roster and go through it and say, okay, in the directory, I'm looking through, okay, how does it affect this person? How does it affect this person? What would they need? Now, that's a very simple, big kind of picture kind of decision that affects everyone. But that can be true with a lot of things, too, that are maybe a little bit smaller. But to go through and think, how does this affect this family? It's being willing to think through these things. And again, go back to the unwillingness to or think you don't need to. If you think about what we had in our first one, it's a willingness. It starts with a heart within that is looking without to the person, the stranger. A heart within that's looking for that, what is good outside of himself. And here it's the person who's inside thinking through things about what's best not just for me in the moment, but for everyone in the long term. Those are harder things to do, aren't they? Very hard. Just. What does it mean to be just? Fair is a good word here. Unbiased. Okay, with that, unbiased. It's the same word, if you know this, for righteous. Which is, at its root, a legal term. The idea of following what's right by the law. Okay? So that's where you get the idea of fairness and without bias. You have a standard you're following. So why then do you have this? Someone we just say righteous, we think of, that's just moral uprightness. But this is a different context for this, isn't it? Because here we have an internal commitment to be, I think, fair. Because that's how God makes decisions. God is righteous. And in that sense, too, he wants to make it possible for everyone to be right with him. And so it's also reaching out. It's not standing back and pointing fingers. It's trying to make sure that there's a consideration for all. That doesn't mean we treat everyone exactly the same. Can we treat everyone exactly the same? Yeah, only if everyone's exactly the same. Different people are in different situations. But in terms of being fair, that you're following a standard for that. Let me explain give you a scenario why that might matter, right? That you've got someone who's committed to following a standard outside of himself and being fair and consistent. Everyone hear that word? Consistent in following the standard. What if we've got a family member of one of the elders who's having some issues spiritually? You could have it that way. You could have it in a positive way of where we're promoting family. Want to push this family member toward getting all the good slots, all those great gigs we have around here. Push family that direction. So, but that's the word is where there's a fairness, so that it is looking at the whole in every single person. Well, it would be unusual to not have family members, for elders not to have family members, especially considering the very first place we started, right? With the family qualifications. It'd be odd not to have any connection there. And so you're also seeing someone who is fair in dealing with people, that even when it comes to family, that everybody's family. There's that, it's not we're all the same, but I can be just as fair with you as my family member, and when it comes down to it, I'm going to make sure that doesn't interfere with this, or be the motivation. And again, where does it have to start? It has to be a really strong sense of fairness and consistency within to say, I'm judging the chili competition, and I know who made this because I'm related, so guess who gets my vote? Family, I win the chili competition. Sorry. Okay. Doesn't matter so much with chili. It could really make a difference with other things, couldn't it? Okay. So being able to look out and just have a total sense of fair, to do that, it means you have to separate yourself from feelings. Not that you don't care. It means that's not what's the controlling factor here, but rather what God wants is. What's best for the church is. And that's what you need to be able to do. So how do you know if someone is like that? Fair, consistent, unbiased.
Would that be a characteristic that you see all the time?
Well, I don't know. That's what I'm asking. Well, show me. Give me some examples. How would you see it?
You would see it in their everyday life, where they're not swayed one way or the other. It's always, they do what is right. Even with their children, as they deal with their children, they treat them as they would any other of the
Okay.
children in the rules and so on. That's
Okay. You got someone who's older now, and now that you don't see that as much with the children, but it is a matter of, certainly that's one of those things that there's, you don't play favorites, right? But it's harder to detect it in the nature of how often we see one another, isn't it? There's someone who's consistently just fair about how he goes about. It's someone, you're looking for someone who's willing to make what would seem to be a sacrifice of preference to do something for himself or for friends or something like that in order to do something that is needed for someone that he's not as close to. Might I suggest that as being one thing you're going to be looking for?
Yeah, I was thinking something along the same lines. Someone who would make a decision against his own personal preferences, but that would be for the benefit of the
Okay,
congregation as well.
that's going to weigh into it. Is what's best for everyone else may not be best for him. He does what's best for everyone else. It takes a good sense of fairness to be able to do that. Yes.
For example, Isaac in the Old Testament would not have been the best elder, and you could have told that by the way he treated his children.
Yes, the way he looked at his children, not really elder material, right? And so you're seeing that, you see that played out in those situations. If you're looking, for example, in this fairness, if we have our group of people in the church, right? Now, I'm looking at, the nice thing is y'all are so scattered out, I don't see any particular groups forming. Yeah, I'm waiting for that. Okay. But we don't like one another. I know, that's what I was waiting on. Okay. But if we're going to if we form little groups where this group gets the ear of, they have your ear, and this other group of people don't, and they have a hard time getting you to answer a text or a phone call, that's not fair. It's not a good situation. So it's one of those things where, no, we're not playing that. It doesn't, by the way, it does not mean that you can't, as an elder, have some people you're closer to. There's no way you're not going to have that. But in terms of how people feel it, in terms of any decision and things that affect them and the care, that's not going to be distinguishable from in any way other than something else. As a member of the church, someone they care about, you're included. And you're following the same rules. You may not go fishing on Fridays, but when it comes to anything you need, they're there for you just like they would be for anybody else. Right. Holy. What does holy mean? And this is a trick question. I'm telling you up front. as everyone checks their apps on their phone. I see you people. Cheaters. Separate? See, you fell into my trap. Separate, apart from. And ordinarily, and I mean probably 99 times out of 100, you'd be correct. But you're not. No, but I'll give you a check mark for trying. Okay. Someone who seeks God? Okay. This is a different word than the typical word for holy. The word you're used to seeing as being saint, sanctified, made holy, all those kind of things. That's, when we see that, we think about that means set apart, okay? Distinct, separate. But that's not this word. There is a slight distinction here. And the idea of this word is an internal loyalty and commitment to right and in context to God. And that is, there's this deep abiding commitment that I'm going to do what's right and follow what's right no matter what. I would argue that though it's hard to find something in English that really gets us across, the best I can come up with to describe is, this is someone who is full of integrity. That when doing the right thing means you're going to take a loss, then things are going to be more difficult. You're still going to do what's right. When the hard way is the right way, you do the hard way. When the hard decision is the best decision, you do the hard decision. You make the hard decision. It is, again, like all these other words here, internally driven with very clear external results. You see somebody who just, if given you ask them, well, couldn't you do that? Well, yeah, that might have been easier, but that wouldn't have been best. That wasn't the right thing to do there. It's that internal commitment that's someone who's wanting so much to please God and to make sure that they're following His will, that just has that priority that it would pain them not to. This is the word for holy that's found referring to Jesus in Acts 2. Quoting from the Psalm. Of a complete commitment and loyalty to God. Now think about this, why you need this. This means that if it's an internal loyalty that is directed toward what is right, toward what is good, toward God, in terms of its context now. But that integrity. It means it's not swayed by politics, church or otherwise. By what passes along here and there, you just keep doing the thing you're supposed to do. It's what keeps you from compromising. Integrity. People can try to, you can get pressure to compromise a lot of different ways. Sometimes they'll try to pressure you by telling you that you're too tough. You're too tough on people. You need to lighten up. Come on. They're trying. And you can also be told by people, you need to get tougher. And what you really need to do is, we're going to do what God says, the way God says to do it. So you've got to have by describing that means you've got to find a man who is not easily pressured, who's not going to compromise, and Therefore, he's not going to be intimidated. Because people, and I'm not talking about you people, but people sometimes who don't get what they want can try to lay down a little bit of pressure. Like not cutting off their rather substantial contribution because they don't like the preaching, right? I saw that happen. There are a lot of things you can do, or just all it is just try to put pressure. And hey, that didn't like something that the preacher said, so I'm going to go lean on the elders to do something. Just make them feel how much I don't like this. I want them to have the negative feelings that I have. You got to be able to handle a lot of pressure as an elder that pushes you sometimes from one direction over here or from the other direction. Sometimes you get it from both sides. And you have to be a man of integrity to set all the pressure aside and then just simply look on your own to see what God says is best. That's what you're looking for. So when you're looking for someone like that, how do you know when you found that person? If any of you who have served as elders want to pipe up and just at least say, yeah, that does happen. You know, it happens. So, how do you know? I'm trying to point out, all of this has to be shown in a track record. None of this is something that you're putting someone in to say, well, I hope he's like this. No. You know. You've seen it.
He's known for it.
Yeah.
And when you said, I think that type of person that's known for that sticks out like a sore thumb. And the way that
Look what you just said about everybody else.
it is what it is.
Okay. You're not going to back down at all, are you? He's not giving in to the pressure. Good job. Good job.
But those people do. You know you can trust them. You go to them for the advice, knowing that they will tell you the truth, whether it's what you want to hear or no.
Yeah. And that's another good statement, what you just said, about someone who's willing to say what needs to be said, even when it's not going to be very popular. Yeah. No, I'd say that's another good way to spot this.
A good indicator too is you don't necessarily have to, you can see it in others' reactions to them.
Yes.
That in at work, in the world, others will react to them in a way because they know that you are that consistent. You're just not that way on Sunday morning. But it's
Correct.
in all of your life. It's in, the people who hang around, they're not here, but, and it's just an example, but one of the things that made me so happy that I was told by one of my daughters was, when they were at school, and they would sit at the lunch table, there would be certain people who would come to sit, and their friends would say, no, you can't sit here because Lauren or Allie's here, and they don't do that. They don't talk like that. So therefore, you can, and that's the type, I'm not saying that Allie would make a great elder. What I'm saying is.
Good to hear.
You can tell it from if you're around them, not just their actions, but the actions of others in interacting with them.
It's to the point of where people recognize that and are acknowledging that in sometimes subtle ways. Okay, it's 8 o'clock. I was sure I was going to get to the next one. If only that person doing the devotional just kept it down, listened a little bit shorter, I could have gotten done. So I want everyone to note whose fault it really was. Okay, that's good. So we're going to stop right there. Would you please bow with me in prayer?